Big Tobacco took the billions of profits they made from generations of addicted smokers and invested in something more family-friendly. Something that could have a big effect on our future. Something that we consume every day. The food we eat. In 1985, tobacco giant R.J. Reynolds bought Nabisco Foods. Tobacco pioneer Philip Morris bought General Foods, and 3 years later, Kraft Foods, making them the largest food producer in North America. And leaving the business of food in the capable hands of the same corporations who helped addict us to tobacco. Using the same tactics they used to promote tobacco, food companies set about peddling the entire planet a diet of processed goods, loaded with chemicals and additives, masquerading as food. This new machine operates with specific targets in mind, like addicting consumers, without them knowing it.
Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. You may be surprised to learn that not too long ago, the largest food companies in the world were owned by Big Tobacco. Yes, you heard that correctly. During the 1980s through the early 2000s, tobacco giants Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds acquired and operated major food companies such as Kraft, General Foods, and Nabisco. This allowed Big Tobacco to dominate the American food supply, generating billions in revenue from well-known brands like Oreo cookies, Kraft Macaroni and Cheese, and Lunchables. During the period when Big Tobacco controlled these food giants, rates of obesity, diabetes, and other diet-related diseases surged across the West. This has led many to ask, did Big Tobacco apply its expertise in making cigarettes more addictive to the engineering of processed food? Joining us today to help answer that question is Dr. Tera Fazzino, Associate Professor of Psychology and Associate Director of the Cofrin Logan Center for Addiction Research and Treatment at the University of Kansas. Dr. Fazzino, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me here today.
First, I should make a quick comment about my voice. It's a bit rough. I developed a polyp on a vocal cord, and it's been a real challenge shaking it, but I do press on. Dr. Fazzino, you are the lead author on research published last year in the journal Addiction, titled U.S. Tobacco Companies Selectively Disseminated Hyper-Palatable Foods into the U.S. Food System, Empirical Evidence and Current Implications. Top line for us, what you found in the research.
So basically what we did was the first empirical analysis to understand whether U.S. tobacco companies played a role in shifting the U.S. food supply towards having more hyper-palatable foods. And it appears that they may have.
So these are tobacco-owned food companies. How did that happen? How did they end up owning Kraft?
Well, most of the general U.S. population, as well as I would say the majority of scientists, are not aware that they've ever had any prior involvement in our food industry. But basically, the two largest tobacco companies, R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris, have a really extensive history. They bought into our food supply in a really major way in the 1980s. And they were instrumental in driving the food supply and the U.S. food industry from the 80s to the early 2000s.
That's amazing. I mean, that's actually at the time that, tobacco control has proven, I think to a large extent, that the tobacco companies were making cigarettes more addictive, and they were also the owners of Kraft and Nabisco.
Yes, the timing is notable.
So let me ask you, what brought you to this research?
My PhD training is in the field of addiction science. And I study alcohol and other legally available addictive substances. I did a bit of work in the obesity treatment area, and I realized that people really seem to have great difficulty in stopping and staying away from certain foods. And in a really compelling manner that to me seemed almost substancy in nature, if you will, like a really, sort of drawing people in and motivating them to consume in a way that they didn't necessarily mean to, and in the face of consequences. And so my work has really focused on first defining and characterizing what are these foods and how do we identify them.
So that's the hyper-palatable foods.
Yes, exactly. And I started looking into, can we define these foods? Because in the scientific literature and the obesity science and nutrition science areas, the types of foods that were difficult to stop eating were just described like descriptively. For example, fast foods, sweets, desserts, which made things incredibly difficult to even compare across studies because we couldn't even tell if we were talking about the same type of food or not. So what I sought out to do initially was to try to develop a definition that could be used widely and that, the field could try to move forward in a systematic way to start studying these foods. In a way, my intention for wanting to make a definition that was data-driven, standardized, and quantitative in nature was that, again, from my perspective, thinking about other addictive substances such as alcohol, we know that in a beer, for example, we can identify what the agent is that causes the intoxicant effects. In my frame, as related to food, we might consider beer and water like basically the same thing. And we would say, well, beer does this funny thing, but we're not really sure why, and we're not really sure how that's different than a glass of water. And so to me, I thought like the starting place was like, we need to be able to define and systematically talk about what these foods are. So hence that was my early effort.
So what are the ingredients then?
So hyper-palatable foods are comprised of combinations of palatability-inducing nutrients. So that is, for example, fat and sodium, fat and sugar, starchy carbohydrates and sodium. And they're present at moderate to high degrees. And these combinations of ingredients don't occur in nature. So we don't see them in foods that occur in nature, such as an apple or even a piece of meat. And so the neuroscience literature has really indicated that this combination of nutrients can do something to our brain reward neurocircuitry and our neurobiology that's very distinct from what whole foods do. They can basically create this exaggerated, like really highly rewarding eating experience. And there's also some evidence that they may actually delay our engagement of our physiological satiety mechanisms that help us stop eating when we're full. And so these foods basically can lead to eating even when we recognize that we feel physically full. And I think a lot of people have probably had the experience of, eating something and it's so good and your brain is like, yes, get another bite. And your stomach is telling you, please don't, we are so full. Like that's what the intention was to get at here, because that's not natural. that's something that we get from an apple.
So if these combinations then are not found in nature, then they must be fingerprints of human engineering.
Yes. So they're engineering, and in a sense, they kind of take advantage of how we have developed evolutionarily. So we've evolved to want to consume, highly, calorically dense, highly tasty things because we needed them to survive. But nowadays, that's a very different picture. But these foods really tend to maximize the degree to which they're reinforcing, which can really be a strong motivator for our future intake.
So they definitely can cause somebody to overeat.
That was the hypothesis when I established the definition and I put that forth in the literature. And since then, we've conducted research to test that hypothesis. And we have found that when we look at a lot of other factors that we know are involved in how many calories somebody eats in a meal, the hyper-palatability of the foods that people consume appear to be a really strong driver of intake within an eating occasion.
Dr. Fazzino, in tobacco harm reduction, we talk about the 500,000 Americans who die each year from combustible tobacco. When it comes to food-related illnesses, what are we talking about? How bad is the diabetes and obesity problem in the U.S.?
We, in the U.S., experience a really significant, public health harms related to the types of foods in our food supply. In the U.S., over 40% of adults currently have a body mass index that is reflective of obesity. Another roughly 30% have overweight. So together, considering that's roughly 70% of the population that is carrying some excess weight for their height and can be a major health risk. We also know that the majority of adults in the U.S. population are metabolically unhealthy. And so we really are kind of in a recipe for some really major health consequences that we are seeing. And a recent meta-analysis that was published in the literature actually documented and estimated that consumption of highly processed and these hyper-palatable foods is associated with an all-cause mortality risk of 21% increase, which is basically the same that we see with smoking.
So, Dr. Fazzino, you published the definition of what makes a food hyper-palatable. What did you do next?
After we published the definition in late 2019, basically, my research program has sought to test the kind of key hypotheses about the definition that we put forth in our paper. And so specifically that included conducting studies to examine the degree to which, consumption of these foods during an eating occasion was associated with greater caloric intake or eating despite feeling physically full, which we have found. We've also done work to examine the availability of hyper-palatable foods in the U.S. food supply. And what we found even surprised us. Our most recent analysis using data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is considered representative of the U.S. food supply, from 2018, indicated that approximately 69% of foods available in the U.S. food supply were hyperpalatable. So this means that basically we're encountering these everywhere we go, and our food system is really quite saturated.
So back then in 2019, did you know what was causing it?
Oh, no, this was, we used a data-driven approach to develop the definition, and then we were, so the definition was agnostic. And so what we intended to do from there was just to see, is this something useful initially that we provided to the scientific community? Signals were looking good. And in addition to what I mentioned, we've also found across a number of studies that people tend to interact in a similar manner with hyperpalatable foods than we see with other substances related to excess use. For example, we found that among individuals with clinically identified eating disorders, that individuals primarily target hyperpalatable foods when they're engaging in binge eating occasions. We found this with a U.S. sample. We've also found this with my collaborators using a Brazilian sample. And we've also found that people use these foods kind of for similar motivational mechanisms, like to feel their positive effects and to cope with kind of negative emotions. So this was really seeming very parallel to what we see with other substances that I study.
So when you started this research, did you start out knowing that big tobacco was involved?
No, not at all. I didn't have a clue. That came as a surprise.
Explain that.
Yeah, definitely. So about 5 years in, I would say, after studying the definition and getting a sense that we're onto something here, like this seems to be doing what we had hypothesized. These foods do seem to operate in a similar manner as other, like, legally available but addictive substances. And so considering those things, and also the degree to which, knowing that the US food environment from our work is just utterly saturated with these foods, I started to wonder why. Like, what about the US food environment in particular really just allowed these foods to foster and grow? And yeah, how did they get here? Why are they here in this degree? So so based on kind of those musings, I did a quick Google search. I thought, maybe, like, could it be possible that a company that knows how to create addictive products might be behind this in any way? It seemed crazy. I just Googled it, and what pops up but two Empirical journal articles from a prominent researcher at the University of California, San Francisco, Professor Laura Schmidt. And basically, in those studies, they documented that US tobacco companies were involved with major US food brands, and they intentionally and explicitly created ways in which they could apply the knowledge, the skills, as well as the colors and the flavors that they developed with their tobacco lines to the production of sugary drinks for kids. And they applied specific racial and ethnic targeted marketing strategies, again, developed from their cigarette lines, to the sales of food to communities in the US. And so we really, this was shocking to me. And so that's what started me down this new rabbit hole.
This is rather an incredible story. You did all this hard work defining the ingredients of the American food crisis, but the connection to a potential source had not been made.
I'm not explicitly related to the foods, no. I mean, so like I said, those first two articles established that the tobacco companies were involved and they applied their marketing strategies. So my question, of course, was, okay, first of all, that's not good, but one could argue that, or people may have concerns, let's say, but one could argue that the tobacco companies' investment in the U.S. food supply during the 80s and 90s could be just good business sense, right? Like they were, taking a lot of hits financially during that period with tobacco litigation and people quitting smoking. And so one could say, like, well, there's not necessarily anything inherently problematic or nefarious about them becoming involved in the food supply. And so that really drove me to ask the question scientifically, well, is there a connection?
I'm astounded by this story. You basically said, what companies out there are evil enough to adulterate food to make it more addictive? And you thought, big tobacco, and then you Google it, and sure enough, big tobacco owned these food companies. Are you surprised that so few people remember this? Because I have to tell you, I completely forgot about it. Of course, I knew back in the late 80s and through the 2000s that it had happened, but the last 10 years of coverage on this issue covering tobacco control and tobacco harm reduction, not once have I heard anybody bring this up.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I was shocked. I didn't know. Most people that I talk with are equally shocked and also don't know. I think from what I can tell a little bit in reviewing and working now in, with the primary source documents and seeing, it seems like there are are kind of pockets of periods in time where maybe a journalist reached out to one of the tobacco companies in the early 2000s and was like, hey, we realize that you're connected to Kraft and these other food companies. So there seem to be like blips on the radar like that. But then I don't know. It has not managed to kind of permeate our general consciousness that like this was a really robust involvement of the tobacco industry in a really meaningful way.
Definitely pockets, there's no doubt. We opened the show with a bit of a bite there from a documentary called The C Word, which Morgan Freeman was the one that was narrating that. I've got a short clip here from a great video produced by Michaela Heck at the Morning Brew called How Big Tobacco Intentionally Made Snacks Addictive. Let's have a listen.
Some experts argue that in some cases, processed foods are even more addictive than drugs, alcohol, or cigarettes. Well, it's not exactly a coincidence. Packaged snacks have always been hard to put down. Oreos were invented as far back as 1912, and snacks like Snickers and Fritos date back to the 1930s. But obesity in the US didn't start causing alarm until the late 70s, and rates really started to spike between 1980 and 2008. So what happened here? Big tobacco had something to do with it. It all started around 1953 when more and more studies came out pointing to the negative health effects of smoking. Big tobacco was, for obvious reasons, stressed about how this could impact their business. So they started looking to diversify their portfolios. And in 1963, R.J. Reynolds, the makers of Camel, Newport, and Pall Mall cigarettes, purchased Hawaiian Punch. In fact, under R.J. Reynolds' leadership, Hawaiian Punch went from offering a mere 2 flavors to a whopping 16. The company's manager of biochemical research at the time wrote an internal memo stating that R.J. Reynolds was in the flavor business, and that the flavors they developed for cigarettes would be useful in food, beverage, and other products, leading to large financial returns. A 1985 company report wrote that the goal in the development of these products was to, quote, leave people wanting more. And this was just the beginning. R.J. Reynolds began growing its food and drink portfolio with the purchase of Del Monte in 1979. So in 1985, R.J. Reynolds buys Nabisco brands for $4.9 billion. Then in 1988, Philip Morris, the maker of Marlboro and Parliament cigarettes, buys Kraft for $13.1 billion. And this is where packaged food really seems to go off the rails. A recent study by the University of Kansas compared the foods produced by Big Tobacco to those that were not between 1988 and 2001, a period of time where Big Tobacco essentially led the food industry.
I haven't seen it. Like, yeah, she was on it. She got all the...
Well, and that's your study, obviously, that she's talking about.
Yeah, no, that was great. I haven't, as I mentioned to you, I haven't seen it, but yeah, on point.
Well, it certainly made an impression in a lot of quarters. Tell us a bit more about the food brands that Big Tobacco owned.
They owned our major American staple brands, Kraft, Oscar Mayer Wiener, Nabisco. They created Lunchables, Planters, peanuts and snacks, and really the list goes on. Yeah, it's a lot of things that now we eat on the regular.
I have the list of the companies that Big Tobacco owned, which you provided in your research. I mean, and it's scrolling across the screen right now. It's an incredible list. How hard was it, Dr. Fazzino, to put that list together?
Well, it required an unconventional process, I will say, and probably many other researchers wouldn't have even attempted it. But what we essentially ended up having to do was, first of all, we did a lot of research and digging into a large publicly available documents repository that's hosted by the University of California, San Francisco, called the Industry Documents Library. There's a wealth of documents and knowledge in there, and they collect documents from litigation and other types of activities involving any industry that affects public health. So what they have in their tobacco archives were many tobacco documents from the tobacco litigation. What we realized in those documents, because they were so plentiful, was that the company reports, the company summary information, also reported on their earnings and their detailed kind of efforts and progress with their food companies. So we found that we were able to, by searching kind of summary level documents where we would expect the information to be pretty accurate. For example, reports to shareholders, annual income, and the sort of assets. And so what we were able to do was we had a systematic process where we pulled every document we could get our hands on. We searched by hand with my wonderful team of research assistants here at University of Kansas. And we identified one by one every single company and every single product that they reported owning for a given year. Once we were able to compile this kind of master list, if you will, of brands and food products that were owned by R.J. Reynolds and by Philip Morris, we then had to find a way to empirically test whether their formulations of the products were different in this period relative to similar types of foods and brands that were not tobacco owned. Therefore, we used several data sets that are available from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They provide information about nutrients, about all the foods in our food supply from given years, going back as late systematically as like the late 80s. So what we were able to do was take documents from the U.S. Department of Agriculture from the 80s, representing late 1980s up through the early 2000s. And we were able to identify all of the brands and all of the formulations of every single product, very detailed nutrient data. And we were able to identify those as being owned by a tobacco company parent brand. We were also able to, using these same information sources and the same source documents, identify the competitors who we were sure were not tobacco owned, because the tobacco companies would make graphs about them and indicate exactly who they were. So we were very certain when we were able to identify who was not tobacco owned. And then we conducted a statistical analysis to understand whether tobacco company ownership of food products was differentially associated with whether those food products were hyper-palatable, using the standardized definition that I created in 2019. And so what we found was, yes, the tobacco-owned foods were systematically more likely to be hyper-palatable relative to the same types of products owned by food companies that were not owned by a parent tobacco company brand. And so this was specifically the case for foods that had elevated, hyper-palatable foods that had elevated fat and sodium. So this was a lot of like frozen entrees, like the quick meals, Oscar Mayer, Lunchables, those types of products. And we also found that was the case for foods with elevated starchy carbohydrates and sodium. So a lot of our snacks, Ritz crackers, etc.
So from the report, 80% more likely to be classified as carbohydrate and sodium HPF than foods that were not tobacco owned?
Yes, exactly. So we found, yes, in our analysis that foods that were owned by the tobacco company parent brands were 80% more likely to be carbohydrate and sodium hyperpalatable relative to the same types of products sold in the food system by the, in the same year, but not tobacco owned. And similarly, we found that tobacco owned foods were 29% more likely to be classified as fat and sodium hyperpalatable foods relative to the same types of foods sold by non-tobacco owned food companies.
Is that at the level of smoking gun, or is it more like getting a fingerprint at a crime scene?
That's a great question. I would say more fingerprint. We we ultimately wanted to do this statistical analysis and wanted to do this from the outside, probably semi wild attempt at a study, because we didn't see anything in the archive that was sort of that proverbial smoking gun. We hypothesized that it's probably there somewhere, but in searching through millions and millions of documents, we have not seen that yet. So that was sort of our next best approach, is to conduct this empirical analysis.
So let me ask you then, if you're at a cocktail party, how do you explain to people what big tobacco did to the U.S. food supply?
I say that my work has indicated that the U.S. tobacco companies basically dominated the food supply during the period from the 80s to the early to mid 2000s, and they appear to have been involved in saturating our food supply with hyper-palatable foods.
Now, do you think this was at the level of tobacco scientists actually, visiting the food scientists and sharing some tricks of the trade? You mentioned marketing. And that's obviously the case. I think that's pretty well proven that there was some marketing knowledge, but was there some scientific knowledge?
We think there probably was. We have done some more digging in the archive. Some of this is still an open question, but ultimately we do know that the tobacco and the food areas of Philip Morris, for example, had an entire program. And this is all, anyone can search and find these documents in this publicly available archive. So it was called a synergy program, where they specifically set up researchers and scientists from the tobacco area to go and do essentially a small residency in the food with the food folks and vice versa. So there was really intentional sharing of knowledge and methodology and resources and scientific kind of, personnel knowledge as well between the areas of the company, because what they were really interested in is how can we kind of maximize the utility of these different areas of our portfolio. And the way to do that is to align forces and make things as interaction heavy and synergistic as possible.
We often hear this on the tobacco, harm reduction side from tobacco companies we talk to, and they say, hey, that was our companies back then that did certain things. That's not us today. Let me ask that question about food. Are the companies that make the food that used to be owned by Big Tobacco, are they still making hyper-palatable foods? And can that be blamed on what the tobacco companies did when they were the owners?
Great question. We also examined this scientifically because we had a similar question, because one could argue that we know that the tobacco companies divested from the food supply between the early to mid 2000s. So one could say, well, maybe the food system just recovered after their involvement. And so what we did was we also looked at data representing our current food supply. And what we found was that, the availability of hyper-palatable foods was just very high. And there were very small differences across the products that were previously owned and were not previously owned by U.S. tobacco companies. There were small differences. For example, there were products that were fat and sodium hyper-palatable were still slightly more likely there was to be hyper-palatable. But overall, a lot of the differences washed out. And what we interpreted this to indicate was that we know from the tobacco efforts that in the marketplace, that when one tobacco company would make an advancement in a way that would make their product have an edge, whether it was, modifying the product in a certain way to release, have a greater release of nicotine, or various other things, that the others in the industry would figure out what that company did and reformulate their products in an effort to keep up and remain competitive in the marketplace. And so knowing that happened with cigarettes, it seems very likely that this also happened with the food supply, where the tobacco-owned food companies really dominated and were extremely successful financially. And so it's likely the case that the non-tobacco-owned companies had to figure out what they were doing to be so successful, and then they reformulated their products to remain competitive as well. What this appears to have done, though, is just utterly flood our food environment with hyper-palatable foods.
That's so disturbing. But, competition does work that way, so I can understand that that'd be the case. Is it an exaggeration to say that many of today's foods are unhealthy because they used to be owned by big tobacco?
I think there are many foods in our food supply that appear to have really been favored and maybe, disseminated to a large degree by the tobacco-owned food companies.
So what's next, Dr. Fazzino? I mean, is this something that you're still researching?
Oh, absolutely. I'm just getting started. So given this finding that essentially brings me back from a conceptual perspective back to my own training in addiction science, some of this makes sense. And now I'm able to use addiction science-based theories and methods to push this research forward. So what we need ultimately, and what we have seen from the successes of the ways that our government and federal entities address the tobacco epidemic, was through legislative efforts and through regulatory efforts that were designed to reduce marketing, reduce the availability of cigarettes, increase the age at which individuals could purchase cigarettes, because we as a society recognize that there are vulnerable individuals. We don't want kids smoking. And we also, recognize that we deserve to be protected from, being inundated with smoking stimuli and access in a way that really harms our health. And so the good news is that that precedent is already set. We already know what to do with addictive products that have been, disseminated into our environment from the tobacco industry. So now they're using that blueprint. We can, start to consider what are the strategies that can really make the biggest difference to help our, population, to, help and protect their health. So this, my primary interest is in looking at various ways that we can regulate these products. And this could look a lot of different ways, but the one that I think would probably have the biggest impact potentially would be that we could actually regulate the nutrient levels of the products. So this could look like, let's say we have in a grocery store, if companies want to keep their products, their frozen entrees, their, fill in the blank, everything that's out there, want to keep them on the general floor of the grocery store with unrestricted access for anybody who wants to pick it up and purchase it. We could say okay, well, you can drop the nutrient, either drop the level of sodium or drop the fat or both to be below the quantitative thresholds that we have established for hyper-palatable foods. If they want to make a hyper-palatable version, I'm not saying we should get rid of them entirely or that we should, go full on prohibition or anything like that with hyper-palatable foods. But let's put those, those really difficult to stop eating entrees and the Oreos and all that stuff. Let's put it behind the counter with the cigarettes. And let's have somebody ID before getting them.
That's a big one. That's big.
It is big, right? I'm like, there are certainly intermediaries in there, but ultimately, like, we have an entire food supply that harms our health at its baseline. We have to work to find something that is actually healthy and not hyper-palatable just to consume. Oh, and they're more expensive. So we really need something at the federal level to protect public health, because ultimately, thus far, it's largely been, an individual should participate in an individual level, weight loss intervention. But then good luck out there. and so it's, in population health, if there's something that affects the population, 70% of the population, we do something at the regulatory or the federal level to address it. We don't put it on the individual and say, go fight the good fight.
So the libertarian part of me, of course, is my hairs up on the back of the neck for sure. A federal police force for food. But as soon as you go, but big tobacco they're the ones that actually own the food, and you kind of stop. It's a bit disruptive because you're like, that's a pretty bad intervention into our food supply. And it might change the calculus for some people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, part of kind of the broader discussion about, how do we address this in the food supply? What do we do kind of on a societal level? Has either been, let the individual decide, which really feeds into what the food companies and, the tobacco companies want, right? Like, we want that to be like an individual level responsibility, even though the foods have been designed to take advantage of that and to make it difficult to stop eating, but like, it puts it on, just on the individual. But also it's the case that, at least with an approach like this, a lot of the broader discussion has been on, if we regulate foods, there's been a lot of discussion of ultra-processed foods, which are similar but different in that, they're often designed to be hyper-palatable also, but they're identified based on their industrial processing. The concern has been that, if we regulate ultra-processed foods, we wipe out 60-70% of the food supply. And then we exacerbate hunger and everything else. At least with this approach, regulating the nutrient contents, we leave all the foods in the food supply. But at least we're able to do so in a way that is more health promoting and doesn't, make every single person who walks into a grocery store or a cafe, have to fight their way to find the 30% of items that aren't gonna, drive their overconsumption.